Hey there, and welcome to the Business of Business podcast. Here we are two daughters and their dad, seeking to inspire and educate you to follow your dreams of being in business by teaching you the business of being in business. The good, the bad, the humor are all parts of our unique perspective as an entrepreneurial family. Thanks for joining us. So grab a coffee, turn up the volume. Here we go. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Business of Business podcast, Two Daughters and Their Dad. I am your host, Staci J. Dempsey, and the J is very important because it's what brings all the joy. I am, like always, with the dad and the other daughter, Jack and Jennifer. Good morning to the both of you.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Good morning.
And we're super excited today because we have with us Doug Hayes, founder and executive director of Covenant Mercies. So good morning to you, Doug.
Good morning. And maybe I should have told you, my name is actually Douglas J. Hayes. So there you go.
Douglas J. Hayes. We'll make sure that production gets that correct.
Here's the question, though. Does the J stand for joy?
That would be a little weird. It stands for John.
Okay.
Okay. You know what? It works. It works. You know what? It's the J that's important. We'll go with that. So, well, thank you for being with us today and being willing to be a part of our podcast. So, why don't we start with you sharing with our listeners a little bit about yourself and a little bit about Covenant Mercies?
I am the executive director of Covenant Mercies, which is a small nonprofit founded out of Covenant Fellowship Church in Glen Mills, Pennsylvania. So I actually serve on the pastoral team of Covenant Fellowship. And almost 20 years ago, it was in 2001, we were working on it behind the scenes. And then 2002, we rolled out this separate nonprofit we established under the auspices of the church called Covenant Mercies, specifically for the purpose of joining hands with brothers and sisters in the developing world to care for orphans. That was really at the heart of our mission from the beginning, maybe a little more broadly as well, to serve the poor more generally, so to speak, in the developing world. And maybe through the years, we've honed in much more on orphans and fatherless children. But yeah, that kind of describes who I am from a business perspective. I'm also a father of 3 daughters, a husband of 1 wife, and grandfather of 2 who've been born and 1 more on the way.
Oh, that's very exciting. I'm glad to hear that it's the husband of 1 wife. That's good. That would have made things super awkward if you had said anything else.
Good place to start.
So basically, the nonprofit, although it's here in the U.S., it is actually serving in other countries, if I heard that correctly.
We partner with indigenous local churches in Uganda, Ethiopia, and Zambia, although our mission is not exclusive to those 3 countries, but thus far, those are the neighborhoods we're operating in. And the express purpose of the organization when we established it was to build partnerships with people on the ground to serve those children. So you may remember all the way back to the turn of the century, the turn of the millennium. There were a lot of millennial goals, even like with the United Nations and all of that. We weren't necessarily moving in concert with that, but the HIV/AIDS epidemic had really hit the developing world in a big way, Africa in particular. And a lot of the treatment, so I always kind of key off of Magic Johnson. You remember Magic Johnson in the 90s coming out with the reality that he was HIV positive, and eventually he's able to get, some of the best medical care in the world. And to this day, he's able to live and thrive. Most of these churches that we were beginning to develop relationships with were dealing with an HIV/AIDS epidemic in their local communities that was, not only making people sick, but it was essentially a death sentence because these parents of children that we ended up serving didn't have access to the kind of treatment that Magic Johnson had. And so typically, if you were diagnosed with HIV, you would just expect to pass away in a particular period of time. And the churches that we were dealing with had a lot, or I shouldn't even say churches we were dealing with. At that time, We didn't really have any partnerships like that, but we just knew that those people existed. Kind of based on the assumption that if we here in America have a desire, and the desire for us comes straight out of Scripture. James 1:27 says that pure religion that's pure and undefiled is to care for orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. And so we knew that if we have this strong desire, even though we're not encountering those who are suffering in this way in our daily lives, that God's people on the ground there also, their hearts are beating for that same mission, and yet they're lacking the resources in order to be able to care for those families in a significant way. And so, I'm probably getting ahead of myself, but we set out to begin developing those partnerships so that we could join hands with those brothers and sisters in doing that work.
So Doug, let's go back to that that start, because obviously, there was, a vision for Covenant Mercies. So, we kind of equate that to, okay, now here's somebody has a vision for a business. It's a startup, so kind of what was like some of the, once it was decided, okay, this is something that we're going to pursue, what were some of those early steps that, you had to take to kind of get the business of Covenant Mercies off the ground?
Yeah, great question. And taking it back, I don't want to make this too much of just my own personal story. I mean, there's a component of it that's very personal. I think that I was being moved in that direction always, from the time I showed up at Covenant Fellowship Church, which again was the church that spun off Covenant Mercies as a separate org. I always gravitated toward those kind of ministries, even in the local community, that would serve the poor and the marginalized. And we had, I would say, both I personally and we as a church had a growing desire to be able to serve orphans internationally. You'd hear about this AIDS epidemic breaking out on the African continent, and knowing that there's something we ought to be able to do, and again, knowing that God's people on the ground there are also wanting to do this. We just began to explore. I went into a year of study, came back to do an internship with the church, a pastoral internship, but it was very much geared toward exploring how can we lead the church forward and maybe even create ways for others outside the church to get involved in the mission of serving orphans internationally. So during my internship year, one of the things we just brainstormed around different ways that we might approach that, especially internationally. It's easier to just kind of build on certain things we were doing locally already, but the international component wasn't really there at that stage. And we just stumbled upon another nonprofit that was set up as an integrated auxiliary. So that's a legal term that you can almost hear within the term itself what it is. It's integrated in some way. We wanted Covenant Mercies to be integrated into the broader mission of Covenant Fellowship Church. We didn't want to just set up a completely separate nonprofit. And yet we wanted it to be a separate nonprofit, an auxiliary organization, so that folks outside of the church would feel comfortable that, all right, if they join us in this mission, they give toward this mission, they can be confident there's a separate board of directors. They're not just giving into this broader church fund that might get used for some other purpose. But no, this is a completely separate budget, financial books, board of directors. And so our more narrow mission in Covenant Mercies is part of the broader mission of Covenant Fellowship, but we're a separate organization. So yeah, one of the things we did, I just kind of had this integrated auxiliary concept tucked in the back of my mind, and at some point suggested that, hey, maybe we should look into this. So we reached out to a nonprofit lawyer, and they gave us all the information we would need. I mean, give it to us. We paid for the information we would need to get things set up properly, so that we could be a distinct organization that also has meaningful connection to an existing organization. And so there was a lot of legal work that went on first behind the scenes before we ever launched the organization publicly. We had set those things up in that way.
Another thing you said there, I think is important. Oh, go ahead, Jen. Go ahead.
Put a word in, Dad.
Yeah.
Doug, let me ask you, first we are talking about vision. And so my next question is, can we talk about money? Because we know that starting a nonprofit or starting a business, we need some money to get it off the ground. So I'm assuming that donations. So how did you get people to buy into your nonprofit early on to fund your legal fees and getting that set up before you even really started? Where did that money come from?
Yeah, great question. I would have to say the legal fees and all that, and this is where it helped to have an established church that was helping us get started. So the church, I'm sure, I mean, it's a long time ago now, but I'm sure because the organization didn't even exist yet, Covenant Mercies, I think the church paid for those nonprofit lawyer fees to help us get set up. It also helped tremendously that this was a well-established church, fairly sizable. I don't know, I'd say 1,000 or so members at that time. So that when we did publicly launch in September of 2002, we did a full Sunday service where we both we began in God's word and talked about the motivation we have from Scripture to do this type of ministry, and then I got up and described what Covenant Mercies is, what our mission is, and we took up an offering that still amazing to think about. Raised $100,000 in that offering.
Wow.
I think there was one gift of like 40,000. So there were a few donors that were able to give in a very, very large way, and then just kind of broad support from this local church that we didn't expect to necessarily be the full funding behind it, but that we did expect this is an organization that's being established out of this church. And so there was kind of ownership from day one from that local congregation. But then after getting that very significant seed money to begin with, the little eaglet, Covenant Mercies, was bumped out of the net, and we did have to begin figuring things out for ourselves. So we didn't, and we still don't. Our funding doesn't come from Covenant Fellowship Church's offering budget, for example. The church is a donor to Covenant Mercies, and we try to build partnerships with other churches as well. But we really do, have our own mechanisms for raising funds, and so that did become very important for me at that time. One thing I'll touch on this now, and we can, if this is an interesting thread, we can talk about it further. But I do remember having a lot of assumptions in those days about where the funds would come from that got adjusted in that first year or two. For example, I expected we'd be writing a lot of grants and, there's all this money out there in foundations, and it's just not that easy, especially as a brand new organization, to crack into that world. You understandably, they don't know who you are. It's kind of like a cold call, and you haven't yet established a track record to demonstrate that you're able to do what you're saying that you're going to do, and that you're faithful to utilize those funds in the way that you've said you would utilize them. So I learned pretty quickly that, that maybe there are some limited opportunities there where you have a personal relationship. Maybe somebody who's on the board of a small foundation or something like that. And so there were some ways to get started there. But I also recognize the main thing we need to focus on in these early years is establishing our track record, so that maybe 5 years from now, maybe 10 years from now, we can approach a different kind of funder and point back to our track record and say, this is what we've been able to do thus far. And if you'll join us in this mission, this is what we intend to do going forward. So, I remember that very clearly, like coming to the realization that the focus right now is establishing our track record. What is it that we're aiming to do? And then being able to demonstrate, before we can really expect others to get on board, we need to demonstrate that we're capable and we're faithful to do the things that we're saying.
Yeah, there's several excellent, learning moments in all that, Doug. I mean, just going back to where you started of, originally that kind of that brainstorming, that here's something brand new. So, getting with people and brainstorming and talking about it and getting different ideas. I mean, that's a great lesson for, anyone who's looking to start a business. Get people around you that maybe have been down that road or whatever the case may be, and really think that through. The second piece that you talked about was then, getting structure to the business, deciding what's our structure going to look like, if it's a one-person LLC or, or if you're going to have a partnership, but, getting that structure in place. And then the third was casting that vision. I mean, you had to cast a vision. Yeah. I mean, you got some seed money, but at the end of the day, to get that bigger number, I mean, you still had to get up there and cast a pretty strong vision for people to buy in, right? So, so that's the other thing. And then the fourth thing you just covered is then understanding, and I know Jennifer, we've walked through this over the past 5 years. You got to let the rubber meet the road. I mean, your business has to take off. It has to start getting a track record and some credibility.
Right.
Now you're in the position to, talk to, the bankers, to the person that you're leasing your space from, to negotiate leases. I mean, you're just in a much stronger position, because, you really do have, because, people might like you, might like your plan, but again, they're not going to throw money at it,
Right.
until they really see that, there's something there. So, so again, even though we're talking about, a 501c3, just some really strong lessons for any type of business person and entrepreneurship there. So, so another question, when, obviously, you kind of made some adjustments early on, but the other dynamic that you bring to this is, now, again, Jen, myself, I mean, we're dealing with the local community, which can be hard enough. Now you're going out there and dealing with, other countries and other countries' rules and regulations and laws and culture and language. And, so that really feels very monumental, to something to overcome. So kind of what was your approach to that? All right, how do we start to really inculcate into areas that we're not that familiar with?
Yeah, great question. And that, I was on a learning curve for all of those things as well, of course, in those early years, and in many ways still am. Anytime you're doing cross-cultural work, you're pretty much always on the learning curve. But I think one thing that became very clear early on was that we need to find the right kind of leaders. So I remember in those years, I read, I'm going to guess that everyone probably has read the book, Good to Great, Jim Collins' book. I read that book back in those days, and that whole idea of getting the right people on the bus was really monumental. Just recognizing, all right, if I can, even though I'm working through cultural barriers, language barriers, sometimes, certainly geographical barriers, I need to be able to find those people who really resonate with our mission and what we're all about. This is even more important for us in Covenant Mercies, because from day one of our core values was the idea of working through indigenous partners. Even though we felt this burden for this mission very strongly, we recognized that the most effective way to do the type of ministry that we intend to do is not for us as Americans to kind of come in and set up shop and do our own thing on their turf, but recognizing that this is their turf, and they will most effectively know how to navigate these issues in their own community, in ways that, talk about being on a learning curve. Like if I was to actually go there and try to do that myself, it would just take so much time and effort to get myself in a position where I really understand how to do this most effectively. But yeah, so finding quality leaders that we could not only kind of pour our vision into, but really almost recognize a compatibility from the start, that they're also eager to do the same things and they understand what we're all about. So that process began immediately. We began just in Uganda, and there's a dear friend of mine, Joshua Kemba, who became that person from day one there, where really we recognize that there's a compatibility here and we understand one another, and we're aiming to build the same thing. There also needed to be some flexibility on our part, which, I thank God that we were able to receive the input of those indigenous partners early on. And maybe in some ways that didn't change our ultimate mission or vision, but like some of the tools that we would use to accomplish that mission were changed a bit because of the understanding of our local partners there. So I'll give you one example. We would have had much more of an orphanage mindset in those early days. Like, okay, we'll go in, we'll help our local partners to establish some orphans homes. And we wanted to do it in a particular family style kind of way. We recognized we didn't want to build a big institutional behemoth. But even there, like we recognized through working with those local partners, one of the strengths of African societies, every African society I've been exposed to, is the strength of the extended family. So even if the generation of parents of small children has been decimated, typically there are grandparents who are stepping forward and taking those children in with very limited ability to care for them adequately, but they knew it was their responsibility to do that. Aunts, uncles, whoever was available within the child's extended family would typically be taking those children in and doing the best they could to provide for them. So pretty quickly we shifted from the idea of building orphanages to the idea of working through these indigenous partners who had networks in the community, understand where these children are living and what situations their families are embracing by taking them in, and began to develop a program that cared for the children within those family networks, rather than pulling them out of this really good thing that is, it's a horrible situation, but it's a wonderful grace that they have family members that they can stay connected to. So why would we pull them out of that context? How much better to come alongside the family and enable this family to be able to care for the children more adequately, and enable the children ultimately to be able to break out of that cycle of poverty, which, through providing quality education and things like that.
I'm pausing just in case Jennifer.
I'm just like, I feel like I'm about to cry. My next question is, where do I send my money? I'm just like, wow.
Yeah.
Powerful.
Well, there's a couple things, there, Doug, that really helpful. For our listeners, one is, identifying very quickly the importance of, building a team.
Mm-hmm.
Now clearly there was some, reasons why you need to do that, but, because of the fact that, you're dealing, a long way off and all of the things you described. So that's one, and I want to come back to that, building a team. And then the second part is, quite frankly, being nimble, being nimble in your thinking, because, I think a lot of us can go in with, kind of a plan or, some kind of strategy, and we're not looking to deviate from that, even though, you know, everything's telling us to do that. I remember reading about this successful basketball coach, and they said, you know, well, what's the key to your success? And he goes, well, the key to my success is I'm willing to call a timeout early. Mm-hmm. Meaning I may go in with a game plan, but once I see the things starting to unfold, I'll quickly call a timeout and say, we're shifting plans, right? So, and I think that's, you know, that's what you're saying here, is that you kind of went in with maybe a certain direction, but quickly saw, well, we got to shift. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important for businesses, especially today, to be nimble. You know, I mean, if you get too rigid and you try to stay the course with something, you know, that can oftentimes lead to a not so profitable outcome for your business, you know. So, but I want to go back to the teen part, because, you know, that's probably one of the things, I know Jennifer would agree with me, is one of the biggest challenges, you know, for organizations, right? So, you know, what we say on our podcast, you know, the most important thing you need to grow your business is people. The hardest thing about business is people.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, and so, you know, so just kind of walk us through maybe that part of it. If, you know, do you have a process of kind of what you look for? And, you know, I know you mentioned about your values and kind of that belief system, but are there other things that you're looking for on who's the right fit for your team?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you're right. It's the hardest part, I think, probably of any type of business. For us, I think part of what has helped us is that we first began with identifying a local church partner. So that local church partner, like the pastor of that church, isn't necessarily, in fact, not even preferably, doing the hands-on work of our ministry. It's better if he's kind of the overarching visionary in that community, but he is helping us to establish relationship with others in his own networks there in that community. So I'm thinking about some of our key leaders. We call them program coordinators in each of our program areas. Most of them have either been members of that partner church or somehow within the networks of that church leadership. We've been able to find those people. And, you know, there's been some hits and misses through the years as well. We've had to fire some people. I hope we've always done it graciously, but, you know, sometimes we've swung and missed. One time I had one of our key donors over in Africa, and we went from all three countries, actually. We went through them together. And at some point, he just turned to me and said, "Where did you find these people?" And I said, "Well, we haven't always had these people. It took us 15 years to find these people. Like it's a process." Yeah. So I don't know how much that helps, but I think, you know, having that overarching network that we're working within, by that I mean the church context, gives us a broader pool to search for those people. And, you know, I think some of it has to do with professional background or certain capabilities, but a big part of the compatibility question, I think, is just really understanding what our mission is all about. And this is not a person who is just in this for the job, but this is a purpose who really gets it. This is a person who really gets it and understands what our mission is. And yes, we also have to eat. So we're gonna earn a living out of this, and hopefully, you know, make it sustainable in that way. So ultimately, what they're in it for is the same reasons that we launched the ministry in the first place.
Dempsey Weiss & Associates is a multi-line insurance agency successfully meeting the insurance and financial needs of the landscaping, business contractor, and agricultural community in southern New Jersey and southeastern Pennsylvania since 1989. To learn more, visit us at www.dempseyweiss.com. J Faith Hair Studio, centrally located in southern New Jersey. J Faith Hair Studio is the place to go to become the best version of yourself. Confidence in your appearance is always important, and a great hairstyle is an absolute necessity. Visit jfaithhairstudio.com to book your appointment today.
And we always talk about that, right, Dad? Like, hire slowly, fire quickly. And it's so hard whenever you own a business to make sure that you are bringing people onto your team that believe in your mission or your culture. And I feel like after 5 years, I'm just kind of getting not as attached, right? Because you want to see everybody work out really with your company, but it's hard to kind of not have that emotional tie to people and realize that some people are going to come and go, and that's okay. We want to keep the right fit for our business. And huge point. I think another great point for our listeners is your network. So I know for me personally, we work really hard on having relationships with, the cosmetology schools in our area. So what does that look like, right? So volunteering our time, going in, teaching classes, really trying to make sure that we're putting our company out there to say, hey, this is what we have to offer, and this is what we're looking for, and building strong relationships with our schools. So, that could go along with a lot of other different businesses to make sure that you have, that network in place. And it doesn't happen overnight. It kind of takes years to build those kind of relationships, and a lot of work to keep up on them as well.
It's interesting. People look at things, right? And they're like, they think that the way things look today is the way they looked right from day one, and you have to remind them, well, this is 15 years in the making. This is 5 years in the making. This is 32 years in the making. It's, there's been a lot of, scuffed up knees along the way, to get to this point. Let's put it that way. So that's great. So talking about team, and now, who would you say in your case, Doug? I mean, who's your client? Who's your customer? Is it the donor? Is that who you would consider to be your client?
That's a great question. And from my vantage point, I mean, I've always had an appreciation for my vantage point, because I go and I visit our program areas typically 3 times in a year. So I'm seeing the impact of the work on the ground. So in a certain way, those children and families that we're serving are our clients. And yet none of that happens if there's not somebody back on this side. So from my vantage point, I'm also both reaching out to those individuals who are supporting our work, and making the case that this is a good use of your hard-earned finances to give toward these children. So I guess I would say the clients are kind of on both sides, but where I focus a lot of my attention these days is actually on the fundraising and development side, because none of these things that we're aiming to do can happen if those relationships aren't cultivated, if the people who are giving toward this now, don't continue to believe that this is a sustainable work on the other side that's actually making a difference. So definitely focus a lot of attention on cultivating those relationships on the donor and financial partner side.
Yeah, the nonprofit world is, I will say that as many similarities that there are between for-profit and nonprofit. In the nonprofit world, I know for Meals on Wheels, the people that we serve who actually receive the meals, we call them our clients. In the for-profit world, typically the people who we serve usually pay for the service or something we're providing to them. And so for profit, we're serving you, but you're paying us. In the nonprofit world, typically the people who we are serving are not necessarily the people who are actually paying for the service. Right. But definitely I know in my nonprofit world, the fundraising portion And the donors are definitely in some ways very much our clients, because we do have to sell
Right.
and show that, what we say we're going to do is really being walked out every single day. And so, so it's a little bit different in our for-profit world than in our nonprofit world.
Yeah. And one thing I like to think about and sometimes articulate out loud is that what we're trying to sell is not the need, but the end result that we're aiming for. So like we have the main centerpiece of the way we run our program is what we call our orphan sponsorship program, whereby people can sponsor a child to be similar to other sponsorship programs that I'm sure folks have heard about. But the goal is not just to kind of provide some relief to this child growing up in very difficult circumstances or to help them survive their childhood, so to speak, but we have real developmental goals for these children that ultimately, when they graduate from our program, many of them are going on to university studies now. Others are equipped either through, maybe a vocational trade or some skill that they've learned to be able to provide for themselves. So what we're selling, if we're putting it in those terms, those kind of business terms, is the long-term project of helping these children arrive to a place of self-sustenance as young adults. And I sometimes even say, I don't get to speak to all of our children. We're serving over 1,500 children now in those 3 countries. And sometimes we'll gather groups of them and I'll get a chance to address them as a group. And, not really that often, but now and then I've actually said to them, like, we'll know that we've succeeded in our mission when you're a young adult and you're able to provide well for your family, and your children won't need sponsorship because somebody's making this investment into your life right now. So, that's the end result we're aiming for. And my preference has always been, even though there's a real need, and in some ways the case has to be made against the backdrop of that severe need. I mean, they're growing up in extreme poverty in very difficult family circumstances. So it's legitimate to kind of paint an authentic picture of the need. But even with that as the backdrop, my goal is always to sell people on the end result that we're aiming for. And, it's nice, after almost 20 years of doing this now, we're starting to see some of the young children we started with. We're reaching that stage where we're seeing the first wave of graduates, beginning to reach that stage of their lives.
That's a great perspective, on, really looking at this from, the long view, and not just the immediate. So when it comes, and Staci, you can even jump in because obviously you're in this world too, but business has changed. I mean, things are changing. So, so what are you seeing? Are you seeing a shift? And we'll call it the donor, of the way you need to communicate, how you get your message out. I mean, how has that shifted? Obviously, COVID's impacted some things, but just even before that, technology, how are you doing things different now than maybe even 5 or 10 years ago?
Yeah. Probably not as differently as we ought to be in light of the changing digital environment, especially. But yeah, we've given some thought and begun to strategize for having a larger footprint in the digital world, maybe especially in social media. That's been a hard one because I don't live in that world. I don't love social media. And yet, we do need to think in generational terms, even. Many of our most committed financial partners would be my age and older. And we need to cultivate relationship with the next generation and show up with our messaging where they're living their lives. So part of this is the use of video. And so we've tried to create little video vignettes that tell the story of some of those kids who are now taking their place as young adults. So they're kind of at the end of the process I was talking about just a minute ago. put those video vignettes into the social media environment and things like that. I wouldn't say that we have done as well in that category in making that shift. And still, the best foot forward for me has typically been to get out and speak live in local churches. If I can get an opportunity to speak somewhere on a Sunday and introduce our program, typically that's been the best foot forward for us in terms of broadening the base. But we're trying to think more in digital marketing terms these days as well.
Yeah, I mean, because I'm sure even though you have, probably a core group of donors that, have been with you a long time and a level of loyalty there for, and buy into the mission of Covenant Mercies. But, we also know that there's also a lot of competing messaging going on,
right,
in our world, for our resources, and so, whether it's in my world on the insurance and investment side, Jen's world in the beauty business, there's always somebody competing, on that message,
right,
through, and typically it's going to be through digital feeds and things like that. So have you talked about, thought about, because I don't know, it seems like once you kind of go into a particular world, all of a sudden you start getting a lot more competing information than that. So all of a sudden, if I show up that I'm interested in a couple things over here, next thing I know, I'm getting inundated with a lot of stuff from, that particular interest. So, are you finding that it's harder to retain some of those donors and sponsors, or do you feel like you're holding on to people pretty well there?
Yeah, I think our retention, I ought to have statistics at my fingertips and I don't, but I think our retention has been fairly good. And, part of it, I think, is that we've focused our attention, probably more so this last decade, really recognized that we need to cultivate relationships with, these aren't just kind of like nameless donors. These are people who are buying into our mission, and they're critical to our mission. We have nothing but dreams and visions without those who are willing to give some of their hard-earned dollars to help us fund it. So, we've paid a lot more attention to cultivating those relationships, and that would be in terms of, both face-to-face and, real conversational updates at times, but also I would say one of the ways that we've grown a lot more in the last 5 to 10 years has been in our just electronic messaging. So I'm not talking about showing up in social media feeds and things like that, but if you are a sponsor of children in our program, or you are someone who contributes toward, I didn't even talk yet about the development of schools and things like that. We're actually building schools in some of our program areas because the local schools aren't really sufficient to provide a quality education for our children. We've got folks giving tens of thousands of dollars every year, toward those type of mission goals. Even just through electronic means, being able to bring updates and, all right, here's what we've been able to do through your giving this past year. Here's what we're looking to do next year. So the next time we're asking for money, it's both with a backward look at what we've been able to do this past year as we've stewarded those finances, and then what we aim to do in the coming year in accordance with our mission goals. So I think our messaging toward those who are already in on the mission has grown over the last decade or so, where we maybe still have some growth is ahead of us, is figuring out how to bring more people into the mission through that digital marketing.
Yeah, well, because again, I know Jen and I talk about this quite often, on our businesses, is people's attention spans. They quickly grow familiar, and next thing you know, it's like, all right, well, we need to change something up. I know, for our business, Janet, is a big role in making sure that we have things going out that have different, topics. I mean, just to try to keep people's attention. So, but boy, a ton of good stuff there. I tell you, a lot of, certainly great to hear about Covenant Mercies, and then obviously just a lot of great business lessons, that we've drawn out of that. So great stuff.
Well, Doug, thank you for being able and being willing to be on our podcast today. We will be sure to link website, Facebook, any of your socials in the description portion of our podcast. You'll also be listed on our Facebook. So again, thank you very much. And to our listeners, just be reminded that you can reach out to us with any questions that you might have that you would want us to answer on any future podcasts at TwoDaughters, that's TWO, TwoDaughters and their dad @gmail.com. And we hope that you all have enjoyed the podcast. We've enjoyed doing it. And until we can all be together again, be kind to each other and be kind to yourself.
We want to thank you for listening today. Please subscribe so you never miss an episode. Leave us a positive review. And we want to say thank you to our sponsors, Dempsey Weiss & Associates and J. Faith Hair Studio.